Just as the sun sets, casting golden light over the town, Tom realizes how far he and Imani have come together, from the cold, lonely glow of the laundromat to the warm embrace of their newfound family. Before we dive into the story, get yourself ready with a positive mindset and a bright smile to feel the story more deeply. If you're ready, comment ready. And if this is your first time exploring our channel or you haven't subscribed yet, please support us by hitting the subscribe button. It truly means a lot to us. Thank you so much. The sharp hum of the fluorescent lights echoed the empty laundromat, casting a cold, unnatural glow over the rows of silent machines. Sheriff Tom Hollis leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. Outside, the town of Bridgeton slept soundly, wrapped in the quiet stillness that only came with the dead of night. But inside this place, something felt different, a lingering sense of loneliness, of abandonment that tugged at Tom, echoing the ache in his own chest. In the corner, beneath the flickering light of a faded, open 24-hour sign, sat a young black girl, her small frame curled tightly on one of the metal benches. She looked out of place, too young, too vulnerable to be sitting alone at this hour. Tom's eyes softened as he watched her, his mind drifting back to memories of his own daughter, Emily. He could almost see her there instead, sitting just as this girl did, waiting for something or someone to arrive, though he knew no one ever would. He shifted his weight, a strange mixture of worry and curiosity rooting him to the spot. This wasn't the first time he'd seen her here, alone and lost in the quiet hum of washing machines spinning in empty cycles. He'd noticed her nearly every night now, always here around the same time, folding tiny clothes with a precision that seemed out of place for someone her age. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Tom cleared his throat and took a step forward. He didn't want to scare her, but something inside him told him he couldn't just ignore it tonight. "Hello there," he said gently, his voice barely above a whisper, so as not to startle her. The girl looked up, her dark eyes widening, and then, without a word, she pulled back, her small body stiffening. She didn't say anything, just clutched her pile of clothes closer to her chest, the fear in her eyes unmistakable. Tom took a step back, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "It's all right," he assured her softly. "I'm Sheriff Hollis. I've just seen you here a few times now. Just making sure everything's okay." She didn't respond, just stared at him in silence, her eyes darting to the door and back again, as if weighing her options for escape. Tom felt a pang of sadness settle in his chest. The girl looked like she'd been through more in her few years than anyone ought to. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong here, something that required more than a passing glance or a silent observation. After a moment, he took a step back, giving her space, though the weight of her silent plea lingered with him. The following night, Tom found himself drawn back to the laundromat, as if pulled by an invisible thread, the soft glow of the neon sign a beacon in the darkness. He parked his patrol car a little way down the street, keeping his approach casual, but his heart beat with a steady insistence that he couldn't ignore. The routine had been established, and he knew what he would see: the small figure of Imani sitting alone, folding and unfolding clothes with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. Tonight, though, something was different. Tom stood outside for a moment, watching her through the glass, waiting for the right moment to step inside. She looked even smaller tonight, her thin shoulders hunched over as she worked. He knew she'd likely tense up again, maybe even bolt if he wasn't careful, so he took a deep breath, softened his expression, and walked in slowly, the quiet chime of the door announcing his presence. Imani's head shot up, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and fear. She clutched a worn jacket tightly to her chest as if it were a shield, but Tom noticed the telltale flash of recognition in her eyes. She remembered him from the night before. "Hi there," he said softly, offering a small reassuring smile. "Remember me? I'm Sheriff Hollis." Imani nodded slightly, her grip on the jacket loosening just a bit, but she didn't say anything, only stared, her gaze steady but guarded, as if gauging whether he was friend or foe. Tom glanced at the row of empty machines, then back at her, trying to keep the conversation light. "You must know this place pretty well, huh? Here almost every night, aren't you?" She looked down, not meeting his eyes, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric of the jacket. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the dryers and the faint rattle of coins in the machines. Tom could tell she wasn't used to talking to strangers, especially one wearing a badge. "It's okay," he continued gently, "you don't have to talk if you don't want to. I'm just here to make sure you're all right." He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict playing out in the tight line of her mouth, and the way she held herself. balanced on the edge between fight and flight. The weight of the unspoken questions hung heavy in the air. Why was she here alone? Where was her family? Was anyone looking out for her? Finally, Tom decided to take a different approach, something a little less direct. He looked at her pile of clothes, neatly folded despite their faded colors and worn fabric, and gave a small nod of approval. "You're pretty good at that," he said, gesturing to the clothes. "Better than I ever was, that's for sure. My wife, Sarah, used to laugh at my attempts, said I could never get the corners right." A flicker of interest sparked in Imani's eyes at the mention of his wife. Tom felt a pang, but he pushed through, keeping his tone steady. "She used to do the laundry for the whole family. We'd all try to help, but she was always the best at it, especially when it came to our little girl, Emily." Imani's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Tom thought he saw a glimmer of understanding, a connection. But then, just as quickly, her expression closed off, and she looked down again, hugging the jacket tightly. Tom felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised even him. He hadn't felt this way since Emily was young, that instinctual urge to make everything right, to shield this child from whatever shadows haunted her. "Look," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, "I know you don't know me, and I know I might seem like just some old sheriff poking his nose in where it doesn't belong. But I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you can come to me. My office is just down the street, and I'm here most nights. You're not alone, okay?" Imani glanced up, her expression unreadable, but Tom saw a trace of something he hadn't seen before, a sliver of trust, perhaps, or at least a willingness to consider his words. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before looking away, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. Tom knew better than to push her, to ask too much too soon. For now, this small connection was enough. He nodded, offering a reassuring smile before stepping back toward the door, feeling her eyes on him as he left. As he climbed back into his patrol car, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed an invisible line, one that bound him to this girl in a way he hadn't anticipated. His mind lingered on the unspoken questions, the silent plea in her eyes, and as he drove off into the night, he knew he'd be back again. This was no longer a passing observation, a simple routine stop on his patrol. It was a promise, a silent vow he made to the girl who reminded him so much of the family he had lost, and he wasn't about to break it. The following week, Tom began to notice Imani's routine with a sharper eye. Every night, like clockwork, she would slip into the laundromat, her small frame barely noticeable under the dull glow of the flickering neon light. He'd watch from a distance, trying to make sense of the patterns he observed, wondering why no one else seemed to notice or question her lonely presence there. The town of Bridgeton was tight-knit, a place where everyone knew each other's business, yet somehow, Imani had slipped through the cracks, invisible to everyone but him. As he continued his rounds, he made it a habit to stop by local spots, casually dropping Imani's name in conversations with the regulars. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who'd lived in town longer than Tom had been sheriff, raised an eyebrow the moment he mentioned seeing a young girl at the laundromat. "That little thing?" Mrs. Johnson huffed, a worried line creasing her forehead. "I've seen her there too, Sheriff. Alone, poor thing. Can't be more than 10 or 11 and always looking like she's carrying the weight of the world on those small shoulders." Tom nodded thoughtfully, Mrs. Johnson's words only confirming what he'd suspected. "Have you ever seen anyone with her? A parent? A relative, maybe?" The old woman shook her head, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "No, Sheriff, always by herself. Sometimes she's got a little bag of laundry, sometimes she's just sitting there, watching the machines. But never a soul with her. It's as if she's been forgotten." Her words hung in the air, adding weight to the growing concern in Tom's mind. He knew he couldn't just ignore it, not when every detail pointed to something far more serious than a simple case of a child wandering out alone at night. The next evening, Tom parked his car at the end of the block, watching as Imani entered the laundromat once again. Her movements were methodical, almost robotic, as if she'd done this 1,000 times and knew every step by heart. She set her small bag on one of the plastic chairs, unzipped it, and pulled out a bundle of clothes, neatly folded, but all worn and faded. Tom's eyes lingered on the faded hues, noting the threadbare edges and the signs of wear that only came from years of use. It was a quiet night in Bridgeton, with only the occasional car passing by. Tom took a deep breath, his mind filled with questions. This girl, this small figure huddled in the corner of an all-night laundromat, had worked her way into his thoughts, stirring a protective instinct he hadn't felt since losing Emily. He watched her through the glass, her every movement deliberate yet heavy, as if each action bore the weight of hidden burdens. She moved like someone who knew loneliness well, who had become accustomed to the silence around her. A pang of sorrow struck him as he recalled how Emily used to sit in the same quiet way when she was sad or worried, folding her little hands together as if holding herself together. Deciding it was time to dig a little deeper, Tom left his car and crossed the street, entering the laundromat as silently as he could. Imani didn't look up at first, but when she did, he saw the same guarded expression, a mix of fear and caution that tore at him. "Evening, Imani," he greeted softly, making his way toward the machines and pretending to examine them. "Busy night." She didn't respond, only looked at him with those big, unblinking eyes, clutching a small shirt in her hands as though it were a lifeline. Tom shifted, leaning against one of the machines, maintaining his casual demeanor but feeling the tension in the air. "I've seen you here a lot," he continued, his tone gentle, letting his words sink in. "You just wanted to make sure you're all right. You know, these nights can get lonely and I thought maybe you'd like someone to talk to." She bit her lip, her eyes flickering between him and the door, and for a second, he thought she might bolt. But then she glanced down at the shirt in her hands, her fingers twisting the fabric, and he saw the hesitation melt just a bit. "I don't need anyone," she said, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "I'm fine by myself." Tom's heart ached at the words, the quiet strength she seemed to cling to like armor. "I'm sure you are," he replied, giving her a respectful nod. "But it's okay to let someone in, too. Sometimes, even the strongest people need a friend." She didn't answer, her gaze focused on the shirt as she folded it with trembling hands. He watched her for a moment, resisting the urge to press further, to ask her questions she clearly wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he shifted gears, trying to ease her tension. "Tell you what," he said, leaning back and nodding toward the machines. "I was never any good at folding laundry. My wife used to laugh at me for it. Maybe you could show me your technique sometime." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, there for only a second, but it was enough to give Tom hope. She looked at him, her eyes wary yet softened, as though testing his sincerity. Without another word, he straightened, sensing that he'd done enough for one night. "You be safe, all right?" he said gently. "And remember, I'm just around if you ever need anything." As he left, he glanced back, catching her watching him through the glass. Her face was unreadable, but he felt a shift, a tiny, tentative connection that hadn't been there before. Walking back to his car, he felt a resolve harden within him. Imani wasn't just a passing concern, she was now a part of his duty, an unspoken promise he couldn't ignore. Whatever shadow she was carrying, he would be there to help her find the light. The days passed, each one drawing Tom deeper into the puzzle that was Imani. His concern for her grew like a quiet storm, filling his thoughts with questions that seemed to multiply with every silent encounter. He watched her each night, his eyes tracing her every movement, looking for clues, trying to understand what she wasn't saying. In her silence, he saw a whole world, a world he was determined to unlock. One evening, he arrived at the laundromat early, hoping to catch Imani before she settled into her familiar routine. The laundromat was still and dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting shadows that seemed to grow darker as he waited. The hum of the machines echoed in the emptiness, their steady rhythm becoming the heartbeat of the place. Tom took a seat by the door, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the entrance. His fingers tapped lightly against his thigh, a subtle expression of his unease. At last, Imani appeared, her small figure barely visible in the faint glow of the street lamp outside. She stepped in quietly, her eyes darting around the room before finally landing on him. He saw her body stiffen, her fingers clutching the strap of her worn backpack with a nervous grip. Her eyes, deep and dark, held a guarded intensity that both intrigued and unsettled him. "Evening, Imani," he greeted, keeping his tone light, trying to ease her tension. She hesitated, clearly wary of his presence but too polite, or perhaps too tired to walk away. She gave him a small nod, her gaze flicking down to the floor as she moved toward her usual corner, setting her bag down with careful precision. Tom noticed the ritualistic way she placed her belongings, each item carefully handled, as if each piece had its own story to tell. Tom shifted, his gaze softening as he took in her fragile form, the weight of her hidden world pressing down on his shoulders. Tonight felt different, the air heavier, as if the truth he'd been searching for was close, just waiting to reveal itself. He leaned back, choosing his words carefully. I was thinking about our last talk," he began, his voice steady but with a warmth that invited trust. "I couldn't help but wonder, where do you go after this?" Imani froze, her hand halfway to her bag. She looked up, her eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and fear, the shadows under them darker than ever. She said nothing, but her gaze was sharp, defensive, like a wounded animal ready to run. Tom felt his heart tighten, recognizing that he was treading on dangerous ground. He had to be careful not to break the fragile bond they'd begun to build. "It's just," he continued, choosing his words gently, "it's late, and a girl your age shouldn't be out here alone." He let the words settle, watching as she weighed them, her eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for any hint of judgment. He knew that pushing too hard could send her away forever, but the unanswered questions gnawed at him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "I don't have anywhere else to go." The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, laced with a resignation that cut through him like a knife. She looked away, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap, as though regretting the confession. Tom's chest tightened, his mind racing with the implications. The signs he'd pieced together, the tattered clothes, her guarded demeanor, the sleepless nights were starting to paint a grim picture. He felt an urge to reach out, to offer some form of comfort, but he held back, sensing that she wasn't ready for that yet. "So you come here every night?" he asked softly, the gentleness in his tone a silent promise that he wasn't there to judge. She nodded, her eyes glued to the floor, her shoulders hunched in a way that made her look even smaller. He could feel her walls coming down, just a little enough for him to catch a glimpse of the hardship she carried. Taking a deep breath, Tom looked around the empty laundromat, his mind reeling with the pieces of her life he was beginning to uncover. The dull hum of the machines, the faint scent of detergent, the cold linoleum floor, these details took on new meaning as he realized this place was more than just a laundromat to her. It was her refuge, her home in a town that had somehow failed her. His voice softened as he leaned forward, making his presence less imposing. "Imani," he murmured, "you don't have to be alone. There are people who can help, people who care." She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time with a piercing look that caught him off guard. There was a defiance there, a spark of something fiercely independent. But beneath it, he could see the unmistakable flicker of fear. "Help?" she repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. "Like who? You?" Tom felt the weight of her words, the years of distrust they carried. He nodded slowly, meeting her gaze with a steady resolve. "Yes, like me, I'm here to make sure you're safe. That's what I do." For a moment, he thought he saw her expression soften, her defenses wavering, but then, just as quickly, they were back. She looked down, her shoulders tense once more, as if shielding herself from the vulnerability she'd almost allowed him to see. As Tom rose to leave, he paused, a sense of helplessness settling over him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let this go. Imani was more than a shadow in the laundromat. She was a child who needed someone to believe in her, someone to bridge the chasm between her world and the care she deserved. With one last look, he stepped into the cold night air, the weight of Imani's silent play heavy on his heart. The following evening, Tom felt a renewed sense of determination as he parked his patrol car outside the laundromat. Tonight, he wasn't just observing or asking quiet questions. He was here to reach out, to give Imani a sense of comfort and hope that he sensed she desperately needed. He knew she was a cautious girl, guarded and wary, but he hoped that with patience, he could help her trust him enough to open up. He entered the laundromat quietly, the hum of the machines and the familiar scent of detergent filling the space. Imani was already there, her small frame hunched over a heap of laundry, her movements slower than usual. She looked tired, even more worn than the night before. He could see her eyelids drooping, her fingers fumbling as she folded the clothes. Tom felt a pang of worry. She was so young, yet bearing a weight that clearly wore her down. Clearing his throat gently, Tom approached her, trying not to startle her. "Imani," he began softly, his voice low and steady. She looked up, her expression wary but less defensive than before. Tom took that as a small victory. "You look exhausted," he said, his tone gentle. "Have you been sleeping well?" Imani shrugged, her eyes drifting to the floor, her small fingers nervously tugging at a loose thread on her shirt. "I'm fine," she mumbled, though her voice betrayed her fatigue. Tom sat down on a nearby bench, giving her space but close enough to make his presence known. "I get it," he nodded, letting a comfortable silence settle between them before he continued. "Sometimes when things get rough, we feel like we have to handle it all alone, like nobody would understand or could help." His voice softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "But Imani, you don't have to go through this by yourself. I'm here. I want to help you." She was quiet for a moment, her gaze flickering to him, uncertainty dancing in her eyes. Tom could see her struggling, her inner walls high and fortified, built from years of handling things on her own. But he also sensed a crack, a glimmer of hope mixed with doubt. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't need help," she said, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than him. I'm used to this." Tom felt a deep sadness well up inside him, a mixture of compassion and frustration. No child should have to feel that way, to carry the burden of survival alone. He wanted to say something, to tell her that no one ever gets used to being alone or scared, but he held back, sensing that she wasn't ready for those words. Instead, he nodded, his expression serious but warm. "I understand," he replied, acknowledging her reality. "But if there ever comes a time when you feel ready, when you feel like talking to someone, I want you to know you can come to me. Anytime, all right?" She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back to the laundry she was folding, but he could tell she was listening. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind of silence that felt like a bridge, something unspoken passing between them. Tom hesitated, then took a chance, his voice barely above a whisper. "Imani, do you have family around? Someone looking out for you?" Her face tightened, her jaw clenching slightly as she avoided his gaze. She didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. Tom felt his chest tighten, his concern deepening. He had suspected she was alone, but seeing the raw emotion flash across her face confirmed his worst fears. "All right," he said gently, not pressing further. "I just wanted to check. I don't mean to intrude." Imani looked up, and for a brief moment, Tom saw something vulnerable in her eyes, a crack in the armor she wore so tightly. "My mom," she whispered, her voice shaky. "She got sick, really sick." Her hands trembled as she spoke, her words fractured but filled with a painful honesty. She didn't wake up." The words hit Tom like a punch to the gut. His heart ached for her, for the loss she carried so silently, the grief that had isolated her in a world that seemed too harsh for someone so young. He felt a fierce protectiveness rise within him, a vow forming in his heart that he would be there for her, however she needed. "Oh, Imani," he murmured, his voice filled with compassion. "I'm so sorry. That's more than anyone should ever have to go through alone." She looked down, her face hidden as she clenched her small hands into fists, as if trying to hold herself together. Tom wanted to reach out, to offer her some comfort, but he knew that his words would have to be enough for now. After a long moment he spoke, his tone gentle but firm. "Listen, Imani," he said, his voice steady. "I know you're strong, stronger than most people I know, but I want you to know you're not alone anymore. I'm here for you, and I'll do whatever I can to help." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and gave the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement of the connection forming between them. Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders, knowing that he'd taken the first real step toward reaching her, that he'd shown her there was someone who cared. As he rose to leave, he gave her a reassuring smile. "Remember, Imani, anytime you need me, I'll be here." She didn't say anything, but as he stepped out into the night, he felt her gaze follow him, a silent testament to the bond they were beginning to build. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep returning, to protect this girl, who had become more than just another face in Bridgeton. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to walk it with her, no matter where it led. The days that followed were filled with a quiet urgency as Tom wrestled with his next steps. Each night, he checked in on Imani, building her trust bit by bit, slowly learning more about her world. It was clear to him now she had no one, and her situation was far too fragile for him to ignore. The idea of becoming her guardian had started as a vague notion, a fleeting thought. But now, it felt like a calling, a responsibility he couldn't turn away from. One evening, after watching her fold her last piece of laundry, he approached her, heart pounding, hoping she'd trust him enough for a deeper conversation. He sat on the bench across from her, his gaze soft yet filled with purpose. "Imani," he began gently, choosing his words carefully, "I've been thinking about how strong you've had to be all this time." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and he saw a flicker of curiosity, maybe even relief, as if she sensed his intentions. "Look, I know it hasn't been easy," he continued, his voice steady, reassuring. "You've been looking out for yourself, making things work as best you can. But you don't have to do that alone anymore." He leaned forward, his expression sincere, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet promise. "I want to help you, not just for tonight, but for every day after." Imani's face softened, though her eyes remained guarded. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of all her unspoken fears and hopes. Tom took a deep breath. He knew this was the moment, the one that would change everything. "I want to become your guardian, Imani, to make sure you're safe, that you have a place to stay, that you don't have to worry anymore. I know it's a big change, and I don't expect you to say yes right away." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching as her expression shifted, surprise and uncertainty mingling in her eyes. Her gaze dropped to her hands, which she fidgeted with nervously, her fingers tracing small circles on the fabric of her shirt. "No one's ever offered anything like that before," she admitted softly, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "I thought people just looked the other way." Tom's heart ached at her words. He reached out, resting a gentle hand on the edge of the table between them. "Not everyone, Imani. I see you, and I care. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him, a glimmer of trust in her eyes, though her face still held traces of fear. Tom knew this wasn't an easy decision for her. She'd been let down, abandoned in ways no child should ever experience. But he was ready to be the stability she needed, and he would wait as long as it took for her to believe it. The next day, Tom made a call to Child Protective Services, explaining the situation to a caseworker named Ms. Dawson, a kind, steady-voiced woman who listened intently. "I'd like to apply to become Imani's guardian," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I know the process can take time, but she needs someone now." Miss Dawson's voice was reassuring, though she cautioned him about the challenges ahead. "I appreciate your dedication, Sheriff Hollis. It's not often we see someone step up like this. We'll need to conduct some home visits, and there's paperwork to go through. But if you're committed, I believe we can work something out." Tom nodded, the weight of responsibility settling on him like a steadying force. He was ready, no matter the red tape, no matter how long it took. This wasn't just about paperwork to him, it was about giving Imani a real chance at a safe and stable life. When he saw Imani that evening, he told her about his call, watching her reaction carefully. Her face was unreadable at first, her gaze flicking from him to the floor, as if processing the possibility of something so foreign. But as he explained the process, the steps he'd already taken, a look of tentative hope softened her features. "Imani," he said softly, his tone gentle but filled with conviction. "I know it's scary, letting someone in, trusting them. But I'm here for the long haul. I won't let you down." She nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if holding back a wave of emotion. You really want to do this?" she asked, her voice barely audible, a mixture of disbelief and quiet longing. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady and sure. "I want you to have a place where you feel safe, a home. And if you'll let me, I'd be honored to give that to you." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with possibilities, with a sense of a new chapter unfolding between them. Tom knew that gaining her trust would be a journey, that there would be hurdles along the way. But he was committed not just to the idea of guardianship, but to Imani herself, to her future, her safety, her happiness. As they parted that night, Tom felt a newfound sense of purpose, a clarity that fueled him. He was no longer just a sheriff looking out for the town. He was a guardian in the making, stepping into a role he hadn't anticipated, but one he was ready to embrace fully. And as he watched Imani walk away, he knew that whatever came next, he would be there for her, guiding her out of the shadows and into a life where she could finally feel secure. The day Imani moved into Tom's home was both joyful and uncertain, like the start of a journey neither knew the way through but both were ready to take. The small, modest house he'd once shared with his family now felt alive again, as if it had been waiting to shelter someone else who needed it just as much as he did. Tom had prepared her room with care, setting up a twin bed with a soft quilt, a little desk near the window, and a few books he thought she might like. He'd even found a small teddy bear and placed it on her bed, a welcoming touch for a girl who'd had too few comforts in her life. When Imani stepped inside, she looked around with wide eyes, her expression a mix of wonder and hesitation. She took a few steps into the room, her fingers grazing the quilt, the desk, as if testing to see if it was real. Tom stood at the door, giving her space, his heart warmed by the sight of her finding her place in this new home. "It's yours," he said gently, his voice filled with quiet assurance. "You can change anything you want, add whatever you like. I just wanted it to feel like a safe place." Imani turned to look at him, a faint, shy smile breaking through her usually guarded expression. "It's nice, I like it." Her words were soft, but to Tom they felt like a step in the right direction, a sign that she was beginning to trust him. The first few weeks were an adjustment for both of them. They navigated small routines, morning breakfast, evenings spent in comfortable silence or with quiet conversation. Tom noticed that Imani was slow to open up, her words cautious, her actions measured, as if still waiting for the stability of this new life to crumble. But he gave her the space she needed, never pushing too hard, knowing that trust wasn't something that could be rushed. One Saturday morning, Tom decided to introduce a new tradition. As he flipped pancakes on the stove, he called out to her, "Imani, How about you come help me with these? She appeared in the doorway, her hair still a bit tousled from sleep, her eyes widening in surprise. You want me to help? She asked, sounding both curious and unsure. Absolutely, he said with a grin. This is our kitchen now, and these pancakes. They need some Imani magic. He handed her a spatula, watching as she hesitantly took it, a small smile creeping onto her face as she approached the stove. Together they made breakfast, her laughter filling the room as he showed her how to flip the pancakes. She was clumsy at first, giggling when she nearly dropped one onto the floor, but Tom didn't mind. It was a joy to hear her laughter, to see her ease into this simple, happy moment. Over time, Saturday pancakes became their special routine, a reminder that they were building something new together, one small memory at a time. In the evenings, Tom introduced her to another tradition, bedtime stories. At first, she seemed puzzled by it, almost hesitant, as if such a luxury was foreign to her. But as the days went on, she began to anticipate it, picking out a book from the small collection he'd gathered on her shelf and settling in to listen. One night, as he was reading a story, Imani looked up at him with a question in her eyes. Did you used to read these to your daughter? She asked, her tone soft, almost as if she were afraid of intruding. Tom paused, his gaze dropping for a moment before he nodded. I did, he replied quietly, the memory of Emily tugging at his heart. She loved stories just like you. We used to read every night before bed. It was our little ritual. Imani looked at him, her expression thoughtful. I like it, she said after a moment. It makes me feel safe. Her words were simple but carried a weight that Tom felt deeply. Each night, as he read to her, he felt his own heart healing, as if she were giving him just as much comfort as he was offering her. The house felt fuller, warmer, as if Emily's memory lingered there, watching over them both. As the weeks turned into months, their bond grew stronger, each shared meal, each story, each small moment becoming part of the new life they were building together. Tom saw a transformation in Imani, a lightness in her step, a smile that came more readily, a trust that slowly unfurled with each passing day. She began to leave little signs of herself around the house, drawings on the fridge, a pair of sneakers by the door, a collection of colorful rocks on the windowsill. Each piece felt like a declaration, a sign that she was beginning to believe this was her home, her life. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Imani turned to him with a look he hadn't seen before, a quiet confidence, a sense of belonging. Thank you, Tom, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. For everything. For giving me a home. Tom felt a lump form in his throat, but he managed to smile, reaching over to rest a hand gently on her shoulder. Your family now, Imani, and family sticks together? In that moment, he felt the weight of his decision lift, replaced by a warmth that filled him completely. Imani was no longer just a girl he'd felt compelled to protect. She was his family. A part of him he hadn't known was missing. And as he looked at her, he knew that their new life was just beginning, built on a foundation of trust, love, and the promise that they would face whatever came next together. The day of the adoption hearing arrived, a chilly autumn morning with golden leaves swirling in the breeze. Tom and Imani sat in the courthouse waiting room side by side, both dressed in their best clothes. Tom had never felt so nervous he could face a room full of hostile suspects without flinching. But this was different. This was his future, their future, and he wanted everything to go right. Imani sat quietly next to him, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her face serious yet calm. She was a different girl than the one he'd first met in the laundromat, transformed by the steady rhythms of their life together. She had blossomed, grown into herself, but today Tom could tell she was feeling the weight of it all. Her gaze was fixed on a point across the room, her brows knit together in thought. He gave her a gentle nudge, his voice soft and reassuring. You ready for this, kiddo? She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, and after a pause, she nodded. Yeah, are you? Tom chuckled, trying to ease the tension. I think I am. Might be more nervous than you, though. He grinned, hoping to see her smile. She gave him a small one, and that was enough to settle his nerves a bit. Moments later, they were called into the courtroom. Tom placed a hand on Imani's shoulder as they walked in together, the click of their footsteps echoing through the large, formal space. The judge, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, looked down at them from the bench. She smiled, giving them a welcoming nod, but her expression quickly turned serious as the proceedings began. The caseworker, Ms. Dawson, was already there, offering Tom an encouraging smile as she rose to give her statement. Your Honor, we've carefully reviewed Sheriff Hollis's application, and I can say with confidence that he has gone above and beyond to provide a stable, loving home for Imani. She has thrived under his care, and it's clear they share a strong, genuine bond. Imani squeezed his hand tightly, and Tom squeezed back, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He glanced at her, catching her eye and giving her a reassuring nod. He was here for her, and he wasn't going anywhere. The judge looked at Tom, her expression thoughtful. "Sheriff Hollis," she began, her voice steady but kind, "could you tell me in your own words why you wish to adopt Imani?" Tom took a deep breath, his throat tightening with emotion. He looked over at Imani, her trusting face giving him strength, and then back at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but filled with feeling. "From the first moment I saw Imani, I knew she was special. She's been through so much more than any child should have to bear. And yet, she's shown a strength, a resilience that's inspired me every single day. Over these past few months, she's become a part of my life, a part of my heart." He paused, gathering his thoughts, his gaze still on Imani. "I want to give her the stability and love she deserves. I want her to know that she's not alone, that she'll always have a place to call home, and someone who will stand by her, no matter what. Imani has given me a sense of purpose, a reason to believe in family again, and I would be honored to be her father." The judge listened intently, her expression softening. She looked at Imani, her tone warm and inviting. "Imani, is there anything you'd like to share? This is your moment too." Imani looked down, her small fingers twisting together nervously. Tom gave her an encouraging nod, silently telling her to speak her truth. She looked up at the judge, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "When I met Tom, Sheriff Hollis," she began, glancing at him with a shy smile, "I didn't know people could care like that. I thought I'd always be alone." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But he showed me that I matter, that someone wants me to be happy and safe. He's my family now, and I want him to be my dad." Tom's heart clenched as she spoke, and he reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. The courtroom was silent, every eye on them as the judge leaned forward, a kind smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Thank you, Imani," she said, her voice warm. "That was very brave." The judge looked down at her notes, her expression thoughtful, then glanced up again. "After hearing from both Sheriff Hollis and Imani and reviewing all the provided information, I am more than convinced that this is the right decision." She paused, looking from Tom to Imani, her voice filled with conviction. "It is my pleasure to grant Sheriff Hollis's request for adoption. Tom, Imani, from this day forward you are officially father and daughter." The words hung in the air, a moment that felt almost surreal. Tom felt his heart swell, his chest tight with emotion as he looked down at Imani, who wore a shy but radiant smile. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears, and in that instant, he knew that every effort, every sleepless night, every fear had been worth it. Tom bent down, opening his arms, and Imani stepped into his embrace, her small frame fitting perfectly in his hold. "Welcome home, Imani," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud to be your dad." She hugged him tightly, her voice barely a whisper. "I love you, Dad." As they left the courthouse, hand in hand, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a quiet joy that settled deep within him. They had walked through darkness to find each other, and now, together, they would face whatever the future held. He looked down at Imani, his daughter, his family, and knew that their journey was just beginning. They were building a life together, one built on trust, love, and the promise of a future filled with hope. A few weeks after the adoption, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Tom decided it was time to share a special part of his life with Imani. As they drove toward the cemetery on the outskirts of town, the golden leaves of fall drifted around them, swirling in gentle waves along the quiet country road. Imani sat beside him, silent but curious, glancing at him occasionally, sensing the significance of their journey. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel, memories tugging at his heart as they neared their destination. He'd come here countless times alone, seeking solace in the quiet presence of his late wife and daughter. But today was different. Today he was bringing Imani, his family, to meet them in her own way. They parked under an old oak tree, and Tom stepped out, guiding Imani along a winding path that led through rows of gravestones. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of pine and fallen leaves. Imani looked around, her gaze curious yet respectful, as if understanding the weight of this place without needing words. Tom paused as they reached two simple headstones side by side, each etched with familiar names and dates that were forever carved into his memory. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and glanced down at Imani, who stood close by, her small hand slipping into his without hesitation. "Imani," he began softly, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of love and loss. "These are the graves of my wife Sarah and my daughter Emily." He paused, his gaze lingering on the headstones. "They were everything to me. Sarah had this way of making any place feel like home. And Emily, his voice faltered, memories flooding back, but he managed a soft smile. Emily was just a few years younger than you are now. She was full of life and always found a way to bring joy wherever she went. Imani looked at the headstones with a quiet reverence, her eyes filled with empathy. She didn't say anything, but Tom felt the warmth of her presence beside him, a comfort that softened the sharp edges of his grief. After a moment, she spoke, her voice soft. "Do you come here often?" Tom nodded, his gaze fixed on the stones. "I used to. After they passed, it was hard to move forward. But being here made me feel close to them, like they were still with me, in a way." He paused, glancing down at her. "But now, with you in my life, I feel like I'm honoring them by moving forward, by building something new, something they would have wanted for me." Imani squeezed his hand, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I think they'd be proud of you, for taking care of me, for making me your family." The words warmed him, filling a part of his heart that had been hollow for so long. "Thank you, Imani. That means a lot." He let the silence settle between them, the kind of silence that held meaning, connection, and understanding. Imani knelt down by the headstones, tracing her fingers gently over Sarah's name, then Emily's, her face solemn. After a moment, she whispered, almost as if speaking to them directly, "Hi, I'm Imani. I know I didn't get to meet you, but I promised to take good care of Tom. I'll be there for him like he's here for me." Tom felt his heart catch in his chest, his throat tight with emotion. Imani's words were simple yet profound, a gesture of love and respect that he hadn't expected but cherished deeply. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Imani. I know they'd love you. You would have been a light in their lives, just like you were in mine." They stayed there for a while, in that quiet communion of the living and the remembered. Tom shared stories of Sarah and Emily, of Emily's mischievous smile and Sarah's boundless kindness. Imani listened intently, her eyes bright with interest and compassion, absorbing the tales of the family she was now part of in spirit. When they finally rose to leave, Tom felt a sense of peace, a feeling that his loved ones were smiling down on them, watching over this new chapter in his life. As they walked back to the car, he glanced over at Imani, who was gazing up at the golden leaves with a serene expression. Back in the car, as they pulled onto the road, Imani spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "Thank you for bringing me there, Tom. It means a lot to know about them, to know more about where you come from." Tom smiled, reaching over to give her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm glad you came. They're a part of me, just as you are now. And being able to share that with you feels right, like they're part of us too, in a way." Imani nodded, her eyes meeting his with a new sense of understanding. They drove home in companionable silence, the golden afternoon sunlight casting warm shadows through the car windows, wrapping them in a quiet, comforting glow. In that moment, Tom felt whole in a way he hadn't in years. He had found a way to honor his past while embracing his future, carrying the love of his family forward in a new form. That night, as he tucked Imani into bed, he lingered for a moment, looking at her with a tenderness that only deepened with each passing day. "Good night, Imani. Sweet dreams." She smiled up at him, a peace in her eyes that mirrored his own. "Good night, Dad." As he closed her door, Tom felt the gentle weight of his memories settle around him, not as a burden but as a blessing. His life had come full circle, and now, with Imani by his side, he was ready to keep moving forward, carrying the love of those he'd lost into every new day they would share together. In the weeks that followed their visit to the cemetery, Tom found himself thinking about the journey he and Imani had taken together, from strangers in the laundromat to family bound by love and commitment. With each passing day, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for her presence in his life, and he could see that Imani felt the same. She seemed lighter, more at ease, as if the weight of her past had finally begun to lift. One chilly evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Imani glanced up at him with a thoughtful expression. "Tom, do you remember when we first met?" she asked, a small smile playing at her lips. Tom chuckled, nodding. "How could I forget? That laundromat was practically your second home. I'd see you there, night after night." Imani's smile grew, her eyes soft with nostalgia. "I still don't know what made you keep coming back, but I'm glad you did." Tom leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the fire flickering across his face. "I couldn't just ignore it," he said, his voice gentle. "Seeing you there, alone, it reminded me of things I'd lost. But it also gave me a reason to hope again. And now I can't imagine my life without you." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire filling the room. Then an idea sparked in Tom's mind. He sat forward, glancing at Imani with a glint of excitement in his eyes. I'm Manny," he began. "We should do something special to remember how this all started. A little tradition just for us." Imani tilted her head, curious. "What kind of tradition?" Tom smiled, a bit of mischief in his eyes. "How about this? Once a month we go back to the laundromat together. Not for laundry, of course, but just to remember where we found each other. We could get hot chocolate, maybe sit on those uncomfortable chairs, and talk about anything we want." Imani's face lit up, and she let out a small laugh. "That sounds perfect. A little weird, maybe, but perfect." She nodded, her eyes shining. "I'd like that. It'll be our place." So the following Saturday, they set out for the laundromat, bundled up in scarves and hats against the brisk autumn wind. Tom stopped at a small cafe on the way, buying 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate, the rich scent filling the car as they drove to the laundromat. When they arrived, the neon open 24-hour sign glowed dimly in the window, just as it had all those nights ago. Tom held the door open for Imani, and they stepped inside, the familiar hum of the machines greeting them. It was quiet, with only a couple of other customers scattered throughout the space, each occupied with their own routines. Imani looked around, a mix of nostalgia and warmth in her expression. "It feels different now," she said, settling into one of the hard plastic chairs. "Not so lonely." Tom sat beside her, handing her one of the hot chocolates. "That's because we're here together," he said, clinking his cup against hers in a small toast. "To us, to family." They sipped their hot chocolates in comfortable silence, both of them taking in the familiar yet now meaningful surroundings. After a moment, Imani looked up, her eyes thoughtful. "It used to feel like this place was my only safe spot. But now I feel safe wherever we are, as long as I'm with you." Tom's heart swelled at her words, his gaze soft as he looked at her. "You'll always have that, Imani. No matter where life takes us, you'll always have a place with me." They sat there, talking about everything and nothing, their laughter filling the quiet space. Tom told her stories from his years as a sheriff, tales of small-town quirks and funny encounters that left her giggling. In turn, Imani shared little memories from her past, stories she hadn't felt safe enough to share before. They were building memories, layering new traditions over old ones, creating a shared history that was uniquely theirs. As the night wore on, Tom found himself marveling at how far they had come. What had once been a place of loneliness and shadows had become a place of warmth, of family. Sitting there with Imani, he felt the ache of his old losses lessen, replaced by a deep contentment he hadn't known he could feel again. After a while, Imani leaned back, her gaze distant but peaceful. "I think they'd be proud of us, don't you?" she said softly, referring to Sarah and Emily. Tom reached over, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know they would be. They'd love you, Imani, just as much as I do." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder, and for a long moment they sat in silence, letting the quiet hum of the laundromat wrap around them like an old, familiar blanket. It was a silence filled with understanding, connection, and the unspoken promise of all the days they would share together. As they gathered their things to leave, Tom glanced back at the laundromat one last time, a soft smile on his face. It was no longer just a place, it was the beginning of their story, the foundation of their new tradition, a reminder of where they had come from and the journey they would continue together. Walking out into the crisp night air, Tom slipped an arm around Imani's shoulders, holding her close as they made their way home. And in that moment, he knew that they had built something beautiful, something lasting. They weren't just sharing a tradition, they were creating a legacy of love, resilience, and family that would carry them through whatever life held in store. The winter months settled quietly over Bridgeton, blanketing the small town in a soft, serene hush. Tom and Imani's house felt like a warm refuge from the chill outside, alive with the routines and comforts they'd built together. Each day brought a new rhythm to their lives, a gentle flow that felt natural, as if they had been family all along. For Imani, this season was the first time she'd experienced true stability. She no longer had to worry about where she would sleep or whether she'd be safe. Now her worries were simpler, like choosing between extra syrup or powdered sugar on her Saturday pancakes or deciding which book to read before bed. Tom watched with pride as she continued to open up, her laughter coming easier, her voice stronger and more confident with each passing day. One Saturday morning, as they sat in the kitchen eating pancakes, Tom looked at Imani thoughtfully. "I was thinking," he said, his tone casual yet laced with excitement, "maybe we could look into some after-school activities. Something you'd enjoy. What do you think?" Imani glanced up, surprised but curious, like, "What kind of activities?" Tom shrugged, leaning forward with a smile. "Whatever you like. There's art club, or maybe music lessons. Or you could try out for the soccer team, I hear they're starting practice soon." She considered his words, a spark of excitement in her eyes as she mulled over the possibilities. "I used to like drawing back when I had more time." Tom's smile widened. "Then why don't we start there? I'll sign you up for the art club, and we'll see how it goes." That week, Imani joined the art club at school, diving into the creative process with a focus and joy Tom had never seen in her before. Each day she would come home with colorful sketches, her eyes bright as she proudly shared her work with him. The house began to fill with her artwork, sketches pinned to the fridge, watercolor paintings taped to her bedroom wall, each piece adding color and warmth to their shared space. One evening, as they were hanging her latest painting of vivid sunset over a field of wildflowers, Tom paused, a thought forming in his mind. "You know, you've got real talent, Imani," he said, his tone full of pride. "You could do something amazing with your art one day." Imani beamed, her face lighting up with a joy that took his breath away. "You really think so?" "Absolutely," he replied without hesitation. "With a little hard work and dedication, you can do anything you set your mind to. I believe in you." The confidence in his voice seemed to resonate with her, giving her the encouragement she needed. For the first time, she felt the freedom to dream about the future, to imagine a life where her passions and talents were not just hobbies but possibilities waiting to be explored. As the winter snow began to melt and hints of spring peeked through, Tom and Imani found themselves embracing each new day with a renewed sense of purpose. They took long walks around town, visited the library for new books, and even ventured to the local animal shelter, where Imani fell in love with a small, scruffy dog named Rusty. Tom couldn't say no to the look in her eyes, and soon Rusty joined their family, bringing a new layer of joy and energy to their home. Rusty quickly became Imani's shadow, following her everywhere, from her room to the yard and even to the kitchen, where he would patiently wait for a treat while she worked on her latest art project. Tom often watched them together, a warm feeling blooming in his chest as he saw Imani's joy reflected in the playful bond she shared with the little dog. Their laughter and Rusty's joyful barks filled the house, making it feel like a home Tom had once feared he'd lost forever. One Saturday, as they sat in the living room with Rusty curled up between them, Imani looked over at Tom, a question in her eyes. Do you think this is what Emily would have wanted for you? To have a new family, I mean?" Tom took a deep breath, his gaze softening as he thought about his late daughter. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "Emily had the biggest heart. She would have wanted me to be happy, to keep sharing love with others. And I think she would have loved you, Imani. She would have been your biggest fan." Imani smiled, her hand resting gently on Rusty's fur as she processed his words. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I feel like she's part of us in a way, like she's watching over us." Tom nodded, feeling a peaceful warmth spread through him. "I believe she is, and Sarah too. They're both a part of our lives, guiding us and giving us strength." In the months that followed, Tom and Imani continued to grow, their lives intertwining in ways that felt natural, like roots stretching out and taking hold in the soil of their shared journey. They made new traditions, from movie nights on Fridays to weekend hikes in the nearby hills, and they celebrated every small victory, every moment of joy together. For Imani, these days were filled with a newfound sense of belonging. She no longer felt like a visitor in her own life. She was part of something solid, a family that would stand by her, no matter what. For Tom, each day was a blessing, a chance to honor the past while building a future with the daughter he'd never expected but now couldn't imagine life without. As spring blossomed in full, Tom found himself standing in the backyard one afternoon, watching Imani and Rusty play in the grass. The golden sunlight bathed them in a warm glow, illuminating the laughter on Imani's face as she tossed a ball for Rusty to chase. In that moment, he realized just how much his life had changed, how much love had transformed him. This was their new beginning, a life filled with hope, resilience, and a love that had been forged in hardship, but blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. Tom knew that, no matter what the future held, he and Imani would face it together, bound by the strength of family and the joy of all they had built. In a world where the vulnerable are often overlooked, this story reminds us to look at one another with compassion and to understand that sometimes, offering a safe place and a loving heart can create miracles.